The storm clouds were crawling across the Wyoming sky when Jacob Mallister first realized he could not spend another winter alone. The wind cut across the barren plains like a sharp blade, carrying dust, cold, and a strange sense of warning. Jacob stood at the edge of his 200-acre ranch, staring at the jagged mountains in the distance, and felt the kind of silence that makes a man question his own heartbeat. For 10 long years, Jacob had survived this land the only way he knew how, by working hard, speaking little, and asking nothing from anyone. His hands were cracked from winters that froze water before it touched the bucket. His back carried the weight of cattle lost to storms and drought. His cabin, nothing more than a small single-room shelter with a rough table and a narrow bed, held no warmth except what the fireplace managed to give. Some men were made for solitude. Jacob once believed he was one of them, but now the quiet felt heavy. It echoed in every corner of the cabin, pressing against him like a burden. He found himself talking to the wind, to his cattle, even to his shadow, just to hear a voice. Anything to break the emptiness. One day in town, old Pete Murphy from the general store mentioned something that Jacob couldn't shake out of his mind. "Men out here are getting wives through letters now," Pete had said, leaning across the counter. "Marriage brokers back east. They send you a picture and everything. Cheaper than dying lonely in a snowstorm." At first, Jacob dismissed the idea. A wife? That sounded like something meant for other men. Men with real homes, neighbors, laughter. Not someone who ate salt pork every night and patched his clothes with leftover rope. But the nights grew colder. The silence grew louder. And loneliness grew into something sharp. So Jacob wrote a letter. It took him 3 days and ruined sheets of paper to finally settle on the words. He didn't write about the long winters or the empty cabin. Instead, he wrote about the mountains, the creek in spring, and the roses that bloomed along the water. He wrote about the work, the honesty, the life he hoped someone might share. What he didn't write, what he couldn't write, was that his heart had become too quiet, too empty. 6 weeks later, a reply came. Her name was Ruth Harper, a widow from Pennsylvania. The paper said she was hardworking, moral, and dependable. But what struck Jacob was the tintype photograph. She was thin, with dark hair pulled tight, and eyes that looked straight into the camera and straight into him. Eyes that held sorrow, strength, and a kind of courage he wasn't sure he understood. She had 2 children. That part made Jacob pause the longest. He studied the photograph for hours that night, wondering if he was capable of being anything close to a father. Wondering if children could stand a man so quiet, he sometimes forgot his own voice. But something inside him, something tired and hurting, said this might be his only chance at a life bigger than loneliness. So he agreed. And when the stagecoach finally rolled into the dusty street of Cheyenne, Jacob stood waiting, palms sweating inside his gloves. The door opened. First came a little boy, about 6, sandy-haired and full of worry in his wide eyes. Then a girl, slightly older, pale and still, like she had learned not to trust anything too quickly. And then Ruth Harper stepped out. She was not the stern woman the photograph showed. She was tired, dusty from the long journey, but there was a grace to her, a quiet strength in the way she placed her hands on her children's shoulders. Her eyes swept the town, the people staring, and then finally landed on Jacob. Not with fear, not with hope, just measuring. This was a woman who had survived too much to waste time on guesswork. Jacob removed his hat. "Mrs. Harper," he said softly. She nodded once. "Mr. Mallister, these are my children, Thomas and Mary." The boy gave a small wave. The girl didn't look at him at all. They loaded their few belongings onto Jacob's wagon and started toward the ranch. The ride was long and quiet. Jacob tried to speak, but his words came out stiff. Ruth sat upright, hands folded, watching the endless plains like she was trying to understand the world she had stepped into. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. "Mister, is that your horse following us?" Jacob glanced back. Duke trotted behind them, reins dragging. He'd forgotten to tie him. "Guess he didn't want to be left," Jacob said. "Can I ride him someday?" Thomas asked hopefully. Before Jacob could answer, Ruth placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "Thomas, don't be forward." Jacob found himself smiling. "When your ma agrees," he said, "I think that'd be just fine." For the first time, Ruth looked at him. Really looked. A small shift passed over her face. Not warmth, but recognition. Maybe even trust. As they reached the top of a last ridge, the ranch appeared below, small, weathered, lonely. Thomas whispered, "Where's everything else?" Quote, Ruth said nothing. Her shoulders tensed. And then, as they reached the cabin, she turned to Jacob with eyes sharp enough to stop the wind. "Mr. Mallister," she said calmly, "before I enter that cabin, you need to hear something." He froze. "My children are all I have left in this world. If I am to be your wife, then they must become yours too. You must treat them as your own. Protect them as your own. Or I will take them back on that stagecoach right now." Jacob's heart hammered. He looked at Thomas, at Mary, at Ruth, fierce, trembling, brave. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I give you my word. They will be my children. This will be their home. I will do right by them. Always." Ruth searched his face for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Then we will enter your cabin, Mr. Mallister." And just like that, Jacob Mallister's lonely life changed forever. The first days inside Jacob's small cabin felt like walking around inside a life that didn't quite fit yet. Ruth moved through the space with quiet purpose, cleaning every corner, washing bedding, hanging the calico curtains Jacob bought, and arranging their few belongings with a careful, almost fierce determination. Her children stayed close to her, watching everything with wide, guarded eyes. Jacob tried to help, but every time he stepped inside, he felt clumsy, too big for his own home. Ruth's presence filled the space in a way he wasn't used to. Her voice, even soft, seemed to wake the walls from years of silence. The children were even harder to get used to. Thomas was curious, energetic, full of questions he tried not to ask too loudly. Mary was the opposite. Quiet, watchful, always studying Jacob as if trying to decide whether he was safe. Still, small changes began to happen. On the fourth morning, Jacob heard shouting from the chicken coop. He ran out expecting trouble, only to find Thomas running in circles while a hen chased him with surprising ferocity. Mary stood outside the fence, covering her mouth to keep from laughing. Jacob didn't think. He vaulted the fence, scooped Thomas up, and set him safely on the rail. "That's Bessie," Jacob said. "She's got eggs under her. She's protecting them." "They'll be baby chicks?" Thomas asked, fear already forgotten. "In a couple of weeks, if we're lucky." Mary stepped closer, curiosity overtaking caution. "How do you know which eggs will hatch?" Jacob explained how hens brooded, how to check eggs without disturbing them too much. The children listened so intently that when Ruth appeared in the doorway, she paused, watching the three of them gathered around a cranky hen like a real family. Something softened in her expression. Moments like that began adding up. Soon Thomas followed Jacob during chores, asking about the cattle, the branding iron, the horses, the far pasture. Jacob found himself talking more than he had in years. Mary stayed quieter but began helping him with small tasks, carrying buckets, fetching tools, studying the land with thoughtful eyes. But the silence of their new life broke the moment they visited town. Their trip started well enough, but the moment they stepped into Murphy's store, conversations stopped. People stared. Women whispered. Men exchanged knowing looks. "Mail-order bride," someone muttered loudly. Jacob felt his stomach twist, but Ruth kept her chin high. She inspected fabric, bought supplies, and pretended not to hear the cruel whispers. Mary shrank at her mother's side. Thomas tucked behind Jacob, hiding half his face. When they visited the schoolhouse, the teacher, Miss Downing, greeted the children with a tight smile. "They'll be behind the other students," she said. "It may take time for them to catch up." Mary lifted her chin. "I can read and do numbers. I helped younger children at our old school." Miss Downing's smile didn't change. "We'll see." The ride home was silent, heavy with shame and hurt. That night, Jacob found Ruth crying softly by the dying fire while the children slept. She quickly wiped her eyes. "I'm not usually given to such displays," she whispered. "You don't have to be strong for me," Jacob said gently. "Townfolk can be cruel when they don't understand." Ruth stared into the fire. "They understand perfectly. A widow desperate enough to marry a stranger. A man so lonely he has to buy a wife. A pair of children who don't belong anywhere." Jacob shook his head. "They see gossip. They don't see truth. They don't see the way you've made this cabin into a home. They don't see how Thomas looks at me when I teach him something new. They don't see Mary helping you in the kitchen or how she watches over her brother. They don't see us trying." Ruth slowly wiped her cheeks. "Why did you write that letter, Jacob, truly?" He hesitated. Something deep inside felt raw, unsteady. "Because the silence was killing me," he said quietly. "Because my voice sounded strange from not being used. Because I wanted to matter to someone again." Ruth looked at him in surprise. "I understand that feeling," she whispered. "After James died, after the farm was lost, I felt like I was fading, invisible. Only the children kept me going." "You matter here," Jacob said softly, "more than you know." When Ruth went to check on the children, she paused, placing a hand briefly on his arm. "Thank you for trying." The warmth of that touch stayed with Jacob long into the night, but their fragile peace didn't last. One morning, the creek was nothing but cracked mud. The drought had arrived early, harsher than anyone expected. Cattle grew thin. Grass died. 3 animals wandered too far searching for water and never returned. Jacob worked harder than ever trying to keep the ranch alive, but the land refused to give. Ruth began helping with the hardest labor, hauling water, fixing fences, carrying feed. She worked without complaint, though Jacob saw her hands blister and her shoulders ache. Then one day Thomas came running from the barn, breathless. "Papa Jacob!" he shouted. "There's trouble! Duke! The horse! He's running! Something scared him!" Jacob ran outside just in time to see a rider disappearing over the ridge, Elijah Thornton, a neighbor with a mean streak and a taste for trouble. And Ruth, pale and trembling, pulled Jacob aside. "He stopped me on the road last week," she whispered, "said things. About you. About me. About the children." Jacob's blood turned hot. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you are already carrying too much," she whispered. Thornton's harassment grew worse. Cut fences, animals driven off, cruel words painted on the barn for the children to see. The breaking point came when Mary ran screaming into the yard. Thornton had tried stealing Duke and pushed her to the ground. Jacob saw red. "Get off my land," he growled. Thornton laughed. "You can't protect them. You can barely lift your arm. Sell me the ranch now before winter finishes what drought started." Ruth stepped forward, shaking with fury. "You come near my children again," she said, voice hard as iron, "and I'll put a bullet in you myself." Thornton left with a promise. "This isn't over." That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The pressure of danger, the fear for the children, the exhaustion on Ruth's face, all of it pressed down on Jacob's chest. Still, he went to bed knowing one thing for certain. He would die before letting anything happen to them. The drought tightened its grip on the Wyoming plains until the land felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Every morning, Jacob woke to the same dry wind rattling the windows, the same thin dust settling over everything, the same ache in his shoulder reminding him he wasn't the man he used to be. But the worst ache came from something deeper, the fear that he was failing the family he had promised to protect. Cattle grew weaker, feed grew scarce, and every day, Jacob watched Ruth work herself to exhaustion, her hands cracked and raw, her back bent under chores no woman should have had to carry alone. Then, one cold morning in early winter, the sky finally darkened with clouds. A storm rolled in, sudden and dangerous. Rain hammered the ground, turning dust to slick mud. The creek roared back to life, thick and violent from months without flow. Jacob should have been relieved, but storms in drought country were unpredictable and fierce. The barn door tore loose in the wind, slamming hard against its hinges. Jacob ran to secure it, but his injured arm gave out. The door swung violently and hit him across the head. He collapsed, blood running down his face. Ruth and the children rushed him inside, working with frantic hands to clean the wound. Ruth's voice shook as she pressed cloth to the cut. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," she whispered. "You can't fix everything alone." Jacob wanted to argue, but her trembling hands silenced him. The storm worsened through the night. Water rose fast, swallowing fences, flooding the lower pasture. The animals panicked in the barn, stamping and crying out. The creek overflowed its banks, creeping closer to the cabin with every lightning flash. "We need to get the animals to higher ground," Jacob said, trying to stand. "No," Ruth answered, "not alone, not anymore." Mary stepped forward, small but steady. "We'll do it together," she said. "We're a family." Families help. So in the raging storm, they worked as one. Ruth led Duke by the reins. Thomas held the lantern high, shielding it from the rain. Mary carried the small chicken coop, Bessie clucking angrily inside. Jacob guided the milk cow, leaning heavily on the children when dizziness threatened to drop him to his knees. The storm roared around them, but they didn't give up. Not once. Not when mud sucked at their boots. Not when wind threatened to knock them down. Not when the darkness felt too heavy to push through. Just as they finished moving the last animal, a lone rider appeared through the sheets of rain. Thornton. For a moment, Jacob braced for another fight. But Thornton's face wasn't hateful. It was shaken. His horse struggled in the mud, sides heaving. "My place is flooding," Thornton shouted. "Lost half my herd already. You need help?" It took Ruth a moment to answer. "We're managing," she called back. Her voice softened. "But thank you." Thornton nodded and rode off into the storm. Something had changed. By dawn, the worst had passed. The rain stopped. The wind fell quiet. And the plains, once dry and lifeless, glistened under a soft gray morning light. They survived, every one of them. Jacob leaned on the fence, exhausted, watching the sun rise. "We made it," he whispered. "Together," Mary added, slipping her hand into his. Things improved slowly after that. The land softened. Green pushed through the soil again. Jacob's shoulder healed more each day. Ruth got steady work helping neighbors. Thomas earned money at the store. Mary took in sewing and impressed half the town with her careful stitches. And word spread. People began telling stories about the Mallister family. About Ruth hauling water during the drought. About Jacob carving toys with one good arm. About the children working harder than many grown men. About the storm they survived. Soon neighbors stopped whispering. They started helping. By spring, the ranch wasn't just alive. It was hopeful. But their deadline with the bank was fast approaching. 2 weeks before they were due to lose everything, a long line of wagons and horses appeared on the eastern road, kicking up dust. Jacob and Ruth stepped onto the porch, confused. The Andersons, the Millers, the Clearys, even folks from town who had once whispered behind their backs. And leading the group was Judge Harrison. Sam Anderson stepped forward with his hat in hand. "We all talked," he said. "We've seen how hard you've worked, how much you've done, and we won't stand by while the bank takes your home." Amy Anderson carried a wooden box. Inside was money, coins, bills, even a gold piece from Doc Henley. "This is for your mortgage," she said. Every family gave what they could. Ruth covered her mouth with her hand, tears forming in her eyes. Then, unexpectedly, Elijah Thornton stepped forward, holding out a heavy leather pouch. "This is my share," he said gruffly. "I've done wrong. You've shown more backbone than I ever had. This is the least I can do." Ruth looked stunned. Jacob didn't have words. The judge counted the money and closed the box. "It's enough," he said. "More than enough. This ranch is paid in full." Jacob turned to Ruth. Ruth turned to Jacob. The children clung to their sides. And for the first time, Jacob felt what home really meant. That night, their yard filled with neighbors celebrating. Someone played fiddle. Someone passed around cider. The children ran in the new spring grass. Mary smiled more that night than she had since arriving in Wyoming. Jacob watched Thomas show his friends how to rope. He watched Mary help serve cornbread. He watched Ruth talk with other women, laughing, truly laughing for the first time. Later, when everyone had gone home and the stars shone bright above them, Jacob stood beside Ruth at the corral. "From lonely rancher to the head of a real family," she teased softly. "How does it feel?" Jacob set down the wooden dog he'd carved for Thomas and pulled her gently into his arms. "Feels like coming home," he said. "And what is home to you, Jacob?" she whispered. He looked at her, then at their children asleep on a blanket nearby, then at the land they had fought to keep. "Home is where love grows," he said, "where promises are kept, where family stands together." Ruth's eyes shone with emotion. She rose on her toes and kissed him. "Then we're home," she whispered. "We're finally home." Jacob Mallister, the lonely rancher who bought a wife, had discovered something greater than he ever imagined. He hadn't just gained a wife. He hadn't just saved a ranch. He had built a family that chose each other, a family that fought for each other, a family that would never again face the world alone.